Welcome to Chapter 4 of Understanding Nutrition. Today we'll be talking about the carbohydrates, which include sugars, starches, and fibers. To start, let's look at these trivia questions to get us going. The brain uses blank as its primary energy source. That would be glucose. And muscles store simple sugars in the form of glycogen. So to explain that, glycogen and glucose, they provide the muscles and tissues with about half the energy they need. That consists of sugars, starches, and fibers, which are in the carbohydrate family. That's the macronutrient family of the carbohydrates. It consists of grains, legumes, fruits, vegetables, and milk. Those are the best and wholesome sources of carbohydrates that also deliver not only nutrients but fiber. So looking at this is a view of the carbohydrates. There are monosaccharides, which are the simple carbohydrates, and those are going to be the galactose, the fructose, and the glucose. The ones that are disaccharides are going to be sucrose, lactose, and maltose. And then complex carbohydrates, that's the polysaccharides. And you can remember all of these because mono means one, di means two, and saccharide is like the name for sugar. So looking at this with the atoms, each atom has a characteristic number of bonds it can form with other atoms. So hydrogen is 1, oxygen is 2, nitrogen is 3, and carbon is 4. And these are the 4 main types of atoms found in nutrients. You should notice that in this simple molecule of ethyl alcohol, each H has 1 bond, O has 2, and then each C has 4. And carbon is the most versatile molecule because it has 4, because it's the greatest possible number of bonds you can have from one atom to another. So let's talk about some monosaccharides. We already listed the 3, glucose, fructose, and galactose. It has the same numbers and kinds of atoms, but they just differ in their chemical structure, and then that changes the sweetness of that molecule. So glucose, that sometimes is known as blood sugar in the body or dextrose in foods. That's what you'll see in the ingredients list. The os means that it's a carbohydrate. Examples of this is honey, that's 30% dextrose. Corn syrup, desserts, and candy, those are all foods high in glucose. Fructose, that's going to be the sweetest of the sugars, sometimes known as the fruit sugar or levulose. And fructose is also found abundantly in honey, fruit, and saps. Fruct means fruit, so that's how you can remember. And then galactose. That's only in a few foods. It's the monosaccharide that's part of the disaccharide lactose. Lactose is the combination of galactose plus glucose. So you will find galactose in dairy products, butter, milk, cheese, butterfat, sour cream, yogurt, but it's also found in honey, beets, and celery. So these are the chemical structures diagrams for glucose. And the glucose molecule has 6 carbons, 12 hydrogen, and 6 oxygen atoms. It's simple on examinations, but chemists have adopted shortcuts to depict the chemical structures. The middle and right diagrams present the chemical structure of glucose, but there's simplified versions for fewer symbols and bonds showing. compared to the left one. That's pretty extensive. And then this is the chemical structure comparing all three. They all have the same number of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens that we talked about. They're just arranged in those highlighted differences is what makes the sweetness different. Okay, now on to disaccharides. We'll talk about maltose, sucrose, and lactose. Maltose is a disaccharide composed of two glucose molecules, and this is just sometimes known as the malt sugar. The enzyme to break this down through the process of hydrolysis is called maltase. And foods that contain this are sweet potatoes, syrups, peaches, pears, malted grains like in breakfast cereals. Sucrose, that's composed of a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule. This is commonly known as table sugar, beet sugar, cane sugar. Sucrose also occurs naturally in fruits and vegetables and some grains as well. It's the primary component used as the granulated sugars in baking. You can remember sucrose, sugar, and the enzyme that hydrolyzes this molecule is sucrase. And then lastly, lactose, which we talked a little bit about before. That's going to be the galactose and glucose molecule combined, and is commonly known as milk sugar. You can remember lac equals milk, and the enzyme that breaks this down in the body is lactase. So when we talk about that, hydrolysis is when it breaks down the disaccharide from two to one molecule each. It just breaks it apart. This process uses water and then those enzymes that we talked about in the body to speed up the process so it's fast enough for digestion. And then condensation, that's the opposite. And that's when it links two monosaccharides together to form the disaccharide, the one unit made of two molecules. And this process releases water in the process. So this will show you a hydrolysis of a disaccharide. As you can see, the bond between the two molecules when it's a disaccharide. In this case, this is glucose plus glucose equals maltose. So maltose is being broken down into its two individual molecules again. And when that bond between the two molecules is broken, water is then released. And it splits it into two, and it says molecules with H added to one and OH to the other. So this actually uses water. And so the water also has to get broken down so that when the molecules are split now to be their monosaccharides, the H can go to one of the molecules and the OH can go to the other, because that makes the molecule stable again. Because when bonds are broken from it, then it becomes reactive. So you need that water to stabilize the two individual molecules now that they're broken down from the disaccharide to the monosaccharide. Okay, and now looking at polysaccharides. Remember we talked about that's the complex carbohydrate, multiple sugars combined. Glycogen and starch are examples of polysaccharides. And glycogen is the storage form of energy in animals. So the definition for glycogen, an animal polysaccharide composed of glucose. It's a storage form of glucose manufactured in cells. It's not a significant food source of carbohydrate, and it's not counted as a dietary carbohydrate in foods. Glyco means glucose, and then gen means to give rise to. Starch is the storage form of energy in plants. If starch is highly branched, it is called amylopectin. And if starch is unbranched, it's called amylose. So that's looking at the individual structures of those polysaccharides, starches in particular. And as we said, the starches are the plant polysaccharides composed of many glucose molecules. Okay, here we have the comparison of glycogen and starch molecules. The glycogen is contained with the hundreds of glucose units. It's normally a very highly branched chain, and each new glycogen molecule needs a special protein, which is shown in the red, to bind to the first glucose molecule. And then comparing that to the plant storage form of complex carbohydrates, that's going to be the starch, and the amylopectin, that is when it's hundreds of glucose molecules that are branched in their chains, or the unbranched form, which you can see is the amylose. And so the structural parts of the plant, that is going to be the dietary fibers. And so the bonds of starch and the cellulose in the plant, which are the dietary fibers, are different. The human enzymes can digest the starch, but it cannot digest the cellulose because the bonds that link the glucose molecules together are different. So if you look at those two structures, the bonds between the glucose molecules, which is represented by the blue hexagon, is bonded together by a different looking bond than the one in red for the cellulose. And so of these dietary fibers with the bonds of the cellulose, soluble fibers are non-starch polysaccharides that dissolve in water to form a gel. An example is pectin from fruit, which is used to thicken jellies. An insoluble fiber, which is again a non-starch polysaccharide made with the cellulose, that does not dissolve in water. This would be tough fibro structures found in the strings of celery and skins of corn kernels. For dietary fibers, the non-starch polysaccharides that are not digested by human digestive enzymes, although some are digested in the GI tract by the bacteria. And this will be edible plant foods, cereals, fruits, vegetables, dried peas, nuts, lentils, and grains. Functional fiber, that's going to be an isolated, non-digestible form of carbohydrate that has been extracted from starchy foods or manufactured from starches or sugars. And these can be used to help prevent constipation, lower blood glucose levels after a meal. However, they do lack the nutrients and phytochemicals that come from the fiber in whole foods. So that's why you really want to get most of your fiber content from the whole foods because of the nutritional benefits that come with it as well. And then, as we talked about cellulose, that's the main structural component of the plant cell walls. And they're isolated, maybe derived from various sources. The isolated fiber, that's going to be oat, hulls, wheat, peas, soy, and cottonseed fiber. And viscous fibers, those are fibers that have gel-forming properties. They're exclusively in plant foods. Rich sources of these are beans, legumes, flaxseed, asparagus, Brussels sprouts, and oats. And then fermentable fibers, those are fibers that can be digested by the bacteria in the GI tract. This is very beneficial for colon health. Example is guar gum, which is also a viscous fermentable fiber from the Indian cluster bean, and inulin, which is normally extracted from chicory roots. So with the carbohydrate digestion, The ultimate goal of carbohydrate digestion is the absorption of glucose, which is the primary component used for energy in the body. Carbohydrate digestion starts in the mouth, and the salivary enzyme amylase works to begin starch digestion. The activity of the amylase then diminishes in the stomach due to stomach acid. That's that hydrochloric acid that we learned about in last chapter. And if the fiber is present in the stomach, it delays gastric emptying. So it does slow down the digestion. Here we want to know FODMAP is a collective term that's used to describe the fermentable either oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polysaccharides that are commonly found in foods like wheat, onions, some fruits and vegetables, sorbitol, and some dairy. If people are experiencing a lot of symptoms from those foods fermenting and getting digested by the bacteria in their gut, like gas and possible constipation, stomach discomfort, even diarrhea, if they're experiencing those symptoms, sometimes dietitians will recommend them to go on a low FODMAP diet, and that's avoiding those fermentable sugars and preventing those symptoms getting caused from the bacteria breaking them down in their system. Okay, and so for digestion, we'll look at the different responsibilities for the small intestine and the large intestine. The majority of the carbohydrate digestion, that is going to be the small intestine. The majority of carbohydrate absorption, that is going to be the small intestine as well. The fiber attracts water in the large intestine, and then the FODMAP digestion produces gas and other symptoms. That is going to be in the large intestine as well. And then maltase, sucrase, lactase, pancreatic amylase are present in the small intestine because that's where those are mostly broken down with the enzyme. And then fermentation and short-chain fatty acids, that is going to be the large intestine. The fiber attracts water, so that softens the stool in the large intestine. The benefits of the resistant starch are that they resist digestion, and limited research suggests that the low FODMAP diets improve the irritable bowel syndrome, which we talked about in the last slide. Okay, so this will look at the carbohydrate digestion in the GI tract with the absorbable nutrients absorbed by breaking down the starch, and then also how the fiber is going to move through without being able to be absorbed by the body. So for starch, which we talked about, it starts in the mouth and the salivary glands. They secrete that saliva, which contains enzymes like amylase that start the breakdown of the carbohydrates into smaller polysaccharides. And then once it reaches the stomach acid inactivates that salivary enzyme, and this halts starch digestion. Enters the small intestine. The pancreas produces amylase again, and it passes through the pancreatic duct into the small intestine, where there the digestion of the starch continues. And it's important that it takes a break and continues here, because this is the position to where it can start to be absorbed by the small intestine. It can't be absorbed in the stomach, so it should be halted so that the nutrients aren't getting released into stomach acid. So the starch then gets broken down by the pancreatic amylase into, again, smaller polysaccharides and now disaccharides like maltose. And then those disaccharides are broken down with their enzymes on the surface of the small intestinal cells, and they hydrolyze from, for example, maltose to glucose plus glucose with the enzyme maltase. Remember, we talked about the other ones. Sucrose being broken down with sucrase into fructose and glucose, and then lactose being broken down with lactase into galactose and glucose as well. And then those will be absorbed by the lining of the small intestine. And then as far as the process for the fiber, it starts getting mechanically broken down when we chew the food that we eat, tears at the fibers, and then mixes with the saliva into the bolus, which we learned about last chapter, and then it goes through into the stomach. The fiber isn't digested, and it ends up delaying that gastric emptying, which makes you feel full longer. And then the fiber, again in the small intestine, isn't digested, and it does delay the absorption of other nutrients. And then as far as the large intestine, remember that's where the fiber is going to hold the water and help regulate the bowel activity. Most fiber passes intact through the digestive system to the large intestine, and then here that's where the bacterial enzymes digest the fiber. And the bacterial enzymes digest it into short-chain fatty acids, and that can be the result of the gas that one has. And the fiber also has the ability to bind to substances like bile and cholesterol and some extra minerals, carrying those out of the body. So it can be helpful in excretion of cholesterol and bile. So for carbohydrate absorption, as we talked about in the last chapter, there's those three types of transport of molecules across the cell membrane. So 3 ways that something inside the small intestine can pass through the cell membrane to go inside the body and into the bloodstream. But as far as nutrient-wise, the nutrients of glucose and galactose and the different carbohydrates of the monosaccharides that get absorbed to go into the bloodstream, those are going to pass through active transport and facilitated diffusion. And fructose is going to be specifically always facilitated diffusion, and then glucose and galactose switching between the two. And the liver is then responsible for converting fructose and galactose into glucose, because that's the primary molecule used by the entire body for that energy source. So it's got to turn into the universal glucose so it can be used properly by the body. And then this looks at the absorption of the monosaccharides. First, the monosaccharides, the end products of carbohydrate digestion, those enter the capillaries into the intestinal villi, and we talked about the villi in the last chapter, being those folds along the intestinal lining that increase the surface area. And then the monosaccharides travel to the liver through that portal vein. And then in the liver, galactose and fructose, those are going to be converted into glucose. And then glucose is then used by most cells in the body for energy. And so for lactose intolerance, that is going to deal with the lactase activity in the body. And the lactase is the enzyme that breaks down lactose, the disaccharide, into the monosaccharides, glucose and galactose. You'll have the highest activity and count of those lactase enzymes when you're first born, and then as you age it just declines from there. And then as the lactase activity and enzyme count decreases with age, or if you have other problems with lactose digestion, that's going to produce the symptoms of lactose intolerance. And those symptoms for the lactose molecules remaining in the intestine undigested, they'll attract water and cause bloating, abdominal discomfort, and diarrhea. And then the undigested lactose, that becomes food for intestinal bacteria, which so then multiplies those symptoms and produces irritating acid and gas, and it furthers the discomfort and diarrhea. So with causes, remember we talked about age, but then you can have a lactase deficiency with the intestinal villi, and when the intestinal villi are damaged by disease or certain medicines, or by prolonged diarrhea or malnutrition, and depending on that damage to the intestine from lactose malabsorption, it may be temporary or permanent. And with prevalence, it varies among the different ethnic groups. It's the lowest in Northern European countries, especially Scandinavians, but it's the highest among Native North Americans and Southeast Asians. And an estimated 30 million to 50 million people in the U.S. are lactose intolerant, and most of them happen to not even know that they are. So for the dietary changes, when you do have lactose intolerance, it's more about managing your dairy intake rather than completely restricting or taking it out. Because that lactose intolerance, it's not like a strict food allergy when even the smallest trace amount will cause a reaction. It's just a reduction in the amount of enzymes that you have to break it down. So therefore you got to reduce how much you eat so that you have enough enzymes to break it down, or that those symptoms from not having enough enzymes is minimal. And so that deals with the gastrointestinal bacteria, because the more overconsumption of lactose that you eat and it doesn't get broken down because of that lack of enzymes, it's just going to sit in your bacteria and in your gut, and then that bacteria is just going to ferment and eat it and cause those symptoms to worsen. So fermented milk products, those can really help, because the bacteria then is starting to digest the lactose on its own already. So it's going to be easier to tolerate, like yogurt and kefir. And then also hard cheeses like cheddar and cottage cheese. Those are often tolerated because most of the lactose is removed with the whey during manufacturing, and then lactose continues to diminish as the cheese ages. Otherwise, diets can get individualized with non-dairy products. Sometimes they can use lactate, which is an enzyme you can take. That's like the supplemental version of increasing the lactase amount in your system to prevent those symptoms from occurring with the lactose just sitting in your gut, because then it will get broken down by the lactate. And then it's important to make efficient dietary changes to supplement for the loss or decrease in dairy products, because dairy products are wonderful sources of potassium, vitamin D, and calcium. So taking those out or restricting those in your diet, you'll need to make up for those through other foods that are high in those sources, so that you don't have the potential for nutrient deficiencies. And so also this looks at the fact that lactose is present in a lot of foods, whether or not it's considered a dairy product. So if you're following a restricted, non-dairy diet, so you think, you can still be experiencing those symptoms because lactose is found in other things like whole wheat bread or a dinner roll or a donut or chocolate, ice cream. And if you think that yogurt is okay because it contains the bacterial cultures, sometimes it's enriched with non-fat milk solids, which then increases the lactose content even higher than milk. So when you're trying to select foods to deal with your lactose sensitivity and intolerance, you want to be very careful and make sure that you're selecting the correct foods so you don't still consider and get those symptoms. And so using glucose for energy, to match these, this will be a good review. The reaction for storing glucose as glycogen, that's going to be condensation, because it's putting two molecules together and going to store it. And then the preferred source for brain and nerve cells, that is going to be glucose. And then the reaction for breaking down glycogen into glucose, that's going to be hydrolysis because that's breaking down the molecule. And then stores 1/4 of glycogen in the body, that is going to be your liver. And then stores 3/4 of glycogen, so meaning 75% of the glycogen, that is going to be stored by the muscles in your body. And so, yeah, this just explains that the muscles are the primary storage place for the glycogen, because they use those sources during exercise. And then the liver glycogen is enough energy to sustain the body for about 1 day. So, glucose for energy, the complete breakdown of glucose yields water and carbon dioxide through that process of hydrolysis. And amino acids of proteins may be converted to glucose via gluconeogenesis. And blank from an inadequate supply of carbohydrates, that's going to be ketones. And so carbohydrate needs to prevent ketosis are 50 to 100 grams per day. And so that's just talking about your body uses glucose and from those carbohydrates as its main source of energy. But when there isn't enough glucose in the body to supply that energy, it switches it to your fat reserves. And then in this case, your fat becomes your main source of energy. But this isn't as efficient or quick as glucose would be. So to prevent this process known as ketosis, it's going to be 50 to 100 grams that you need per day. And then when glucose is abundant and glycogen stores are full, the liver converts that glucose to fat, and that's when those fat stores will increase and you'll gain weight. Proteins have their own jobs to perform that cannot be done by other nutrients, so it's important that you're not using proteins as an energy source. That's, that will be like muscle wasting when you start having to use the proteins in your muscle as energy, and that can be a really bad sign with malnutrition, with muscle wasting. And ketones are an alternative fuel source during starvation, and so that's where ketosis comes into hand, and that disturbs the normal acid-base balance in your body, and the fat stores are unlimited. So the constancy of blood glucose, there's a steady supply in the bloodstream, with the intestines absorbing it from the food and then it going into the bloodstream. Or if there isn't glucose in your blood or enough glucose, then the liver will take the glycogen and convert it into glucose and put that in the bloodstream. So there's a steady supply either way, whether it's from your food or from the fat stores in your liver. And then blood glucose homeostasis, that's important because you'll always want that steady supply to have the healthy blood sugar level so that your cells are constantly getting the energy that they need to function. And so insulin, that helps move glucose from the blood into cells when you have enough glucose in your blood, or to lower it if it's too high. And then glucagon and epinephrine, that breaks down the glycogen to glucose in that liver so that you can get glucose in your bloodstream again if you didn't eat and you don't have it coming from your intestine that way. And so this is a diagram that shows how the body helps maintain that blood glucose homeostasis. When there's high blood glucose, that signals the pancreas to secrete insulin so that the glucose moves from the blood to the cells. And then the insulin, that stimulates the uptake of glucose from the blood into the cells, or the storage of glycogen in the liver and muscles, and then also the conversion of excess glucose into fat for storage, if those glycogen storages then are taken up. And then that results in the lowering of the blood glucose when it's too high in the blood, and insulin secretion stops. But then when the blood glucose are too low in the body, that signals the pancreas to secrete glucagon into the blood. And then the glucagon is going to break down the glycogen from the liver, and that's going to release the glucose into the blood. And then the end result will be a raised blood glucose level in your blood, and the glucagon secretion will be inhibited once normal levels are brought together with homeostasis. And then this talks about keeping it balanced within the normal ranges. It's important to do this, and that homeostasis occurs between meals and when you're at intervals of not eating. But it's important to eat balanced meals at regular intervals so that your blood glucose level can stay maintained. With diabetes, that's when the insulin is either inadequate or ineffective in taking that glucose from the blood and putting it into your cells. Diabetes, it's the metabolic disorder that is characterized by elevated blood glucose in the blood as a result of the insufficient insulin or ineffective insulin, or both sometimes. And the complete medical term is diabetes mellitus. And when the blood glucose levels are higher than normal but below the diagnosis of diabetes, is called prediabetes. And the normal fasting blood glucose level is 70 to 99, but then the prediabetes is going to be 100 to 125. And then the diabetes is when it's above, when your fasting glucose levels is above that. So for type 1 diabetes, that's less common type. That's when the pancreas produces little or no insulin. And type 1 is usually a result from an autoimmune destruction of the pancreatic beta cells, which produce that insulin. So you're born with it. And then for type 2 diabetes, that's the most common type, and it's where the cells fail to respond to the insulin because of insulin resistance. And usually that's accompanied by obesity. And this results from insulin resistance coupled with insufficient insulin secretion. Hypoglycemia, that's an abnormally low blood glucose concentration. Symptoms are weakness, rapid heartbeat, sweating, anxiety, hungry, and trembling. Normally, it's a consequence of either poorly managed diabetes, too much insulin, strenuous physical activity, inadequate food intake, or illness. but in healthy people, it's rare. Normally, you can relieve the symptoms of hypoglycemia by adjusting your diet and replacing refined carbohydrates with fiber to leave you full and with lasting energy, rich carbs and protein, and then also smaller meals, eating more frequently at those regular intervals. That can help. But it could also be caused from certain medications, pancreatic tumors, overuse of insulin, or alcohol abuse. And so the glycemic response refers to the speed of glucose absorption, the blood glucose levels, and return to normal glucose levels. And then apples, corn tortillas, and rolled oats are good examples of foods with a low glycemic response. And watermelon and white rice, those cause blood glucoses to rise or spike rapidly. And then following this, the blood glucose levels will plunge or drop. With the blood glucose levels dropping rapidly after a high glycemic response, that will be from the foods due an overcorrection. And the usefulness and practicality of the glycemic index is controversial as far as what foods give you a high glycemic response and what foods give you a low. But generally about it, after foods are judged based on the glycemic response that they create in the body, and they can vary depending on the situation as a whole. So that's why there's some inconsistencies, is because the glycemic response in general will depend on more factors than just the food itself, like the time of day or whether or not you're being active. But in general, after a high glycemic meal, blood glucose levels rise dramatically and then fall below normal. After a low glycemic meal, blood glucose levels rise gradually and then fall to near normal. So the glycemic response is the extent to which a food raises the blood glucose concentrations and elicits an insulin response. The glycemic index are those methods of classifying foods according to their potential of creating a glycemic response, raising that blood glucose. Examples of low glycemic index foods would be barley, oats, spaghetti noodles, apple, banana, orange, carrots, milk products, even chocolate. Medium glycemic index, that's going to be like brown rice, potatoes that are fried, sweet potatoes, popcorn. And then high glycemic index, that's going to be breads, breakfast cereals, white rice, watermelon is one, rice crackers, and boiled potatoes. So with dental caries, there can be several problems that consuming sugary foods can cause to your teeth. The bacteria ferment these sugars, producing acid, and then that acid will erode your tooth enamel. There's factors associated with the tooth decay, like the amount of time allotted that the food is in your mouth for, or whether or not that food was a sticky food, so it sticks to your teeth, and with the frequency of how much you're eating those sugary foods. With also your food and beverage choices, whether or not your beverages are sugary soft drinks or water or fluorinated water is really good to help with the remineralization process. But factors of tooth decay will be the bacteria that reside in your dental plaque, the saliva that cleanses your mouth, the minerals that form your teeth, and with food that remains after you swallow, whether or not you're regularly brushing them with fluoride toothpaste, and flossing, that can be very effective in preventing dental caries. The Dietary Guidelines of America recommends that you practice good oral hygiene, you drink fluoridated water, and you consume sugar and starch containing foods and beverages less frequently. Here's an illustration with your dental caries, and that just shows how they begin when acid dissolves the enamel and covers the tooth, and then if not repaired, that decay then may penetrate the dentin and then spread into the pulp of the tooth, which will cause those problems, cavities, inflammation, the abscess, or possible loss of your tooth. And so because of that, the dietary guidelines recommend that Americans limit their intake of added sugar to 10% of total calories per day, because the added sugars provide calories with few or no nutrients. And with that, looking at the updated food labels that separately list whether or not that carbohydrate is an added sugar, that's important to look at. And you can also use helpful tidbits on how to estimate that sugar. To estimate, keep in mind that 1 teaspoon of sugar, whether that's white, brown, corn syrup, like in the form of a jam or jelly or honey, that is going to be 1 teaspoon, about 5 grams of carbohydrate, or 20 calories per teaspoon. Some are lower, like table sugar is only 16 actually, and honey is higher, 22. But that's going to be a rough estimate. It's 20 calories per teaspoon. Also, you can use 1 tablespoon of ketchup is equal to 1 teaspoon of sugar. 12 ounces of soda, that's also going to be equal to 10 teaspoons of sugar. But there is no established UL of added sugars yet. It's just the excessive intake has been shown to interfere with sound nutrition and good health. To this extent, the daily recommended intake suggests added sugars should be no more than 25% of the day's total energy intake. They recommend the 10%, but the DRI says no more than 25%. And they say that 1/8 of the U.S. population still is exceeding this maximum intake. When the added sugars occupy this much of the diet, nutrient deficiencies are very likely because the 5 food groups usually fall below their recommendations. Upon that 25% in a 2,000 calorie diet, that's going to be about 500 calories or 125 grams of sugar. That's 31 teaspoons, which kind of, to give you a better idea, that looks like half a cup of honey, 23 marshmallows, or 40 ounces of cola. Those are all equal to the maximum amount, the very maximum, the 25% that you should be allowed to intake. But the WHO, World Health Organization, recommends the 10%, and the American Health Association recommends no more than 5% actually of added sugars for optimal health. And so some people are then trying to watch their sugar intake and want their food to still be sweet. They use alternative sweeteners. The first is artificial sweeteners. This is also called non-nutritive sweeteners because they yield no energy, or in like the case of aspartame, which is the artificial sweetener, that energy yield is very insignificant or trivial. The estimated amount of a sweetener that individuals can safely consume each day over the course of a lifetime without adverse effects is going to be the ADI, the acceptable daily intake. The GRAS that's associated with this, it's food additives that have been long in use and are believed to be safe. It was first established by FDA in 1958, and the list is subject to change as we're learning more about these sweeteners. Stevia is a herbal product. It's natural. It's found in South America from the glycosides that are in the stevia leaf. Or another example of a natural high-intensity sweetener would be the monk fruit, which is popular, it's from China. And then another alternative sweetener that consumers use are the sugar alcohols. This is a sugar-like compound that can be derived from fruits, but mostly commercially produced from glucose. And examples are lactitol, maltitol, sorbitol, xylitol, and those are going to be nutritive sweeteners because in this case they do yield energy. So both sugars and sugar alcohols are nutritive sweeteners. Sugar alcohols are just lower in their providing of calories. They're about 0.2 to 2.6 calories per gram, which is less than sugars. There's benefits to using sugar alcohols. They provoke a low glycemic response because of the body's inability to absorb that sugar alcohol completely or to absorb it very slowly. And it doesn't contribute to dental caries as much because that bacteria in your mouth isn't able to metabolize the sugar alcohol as rapidly as regular sugar, creating that enamel decay. And so there are benefits to consuming the sugar alcohol, but also side effects. Some of the bacteria in your GI tract, they'll metabolize the unabsorbed sugar part of the alcohol, and that will produce intestinal gas, abdominal discomfort, and diarrhea. And so excessive consumption of these sugar alcohols can be a laxative effect and produce those unwanted digestive problems. There are many health effects to consuming the right carbohydrates, which we have been talking about are the whole grains, the vegetables, the legumes, and the fruit. These are so beneficial because they're noted for their starch, their fiber, their naturally occurring sugars that supply the body with good energy. And because of this, your carbohydrate intake should be about 45 to 65%, and fulfilling this will eliminate your probability of exceeding in your fat content, which is only supposed to be 20 to 35% of your calories. And so that will support good health and a good balanced diet. Also, the carbohydrates have valuable properties of supplying vitamins, minerals. The diets rich in these will help also protect against heart attack and stroke by being able to lower the blood pressure and improve blood lipid levels and reducing inflammation. Due to these diets being high in the whole grains and fruits and vegetables and legumes, focusing on those foods will lower your animal fat and cholesterol intake, and that can also be heightened with dietary fibers and vegetable proteins and the phytochemicals that come from the vegetables. With soluble fibers like oat bran, barley, and legumes, those help lower blood cholesterol by binding with bile acids in the GI tract, and then will further increase the excretion of cholesterol out of your body. And then because of that, the bile will need to be reformed by the liver, which will use even more cholesterol. So that will definitely lower your blood cholesterol levels, and the bacterial products of their fiber fermentation in the colon can also inhibit cholesterol synthesis in the liver. Fiber helps by displacing fats in the diet, and then this allows for improvement of heart disease risk factors. Diabetes, with soluble fibers, those trap nutrients and delay the transit throughout the GI tract, and this will slow down that glucose absorption and prevent surges of glucose spikes and rebounds. Also, it can help your GI health with enhancing the health of the large intestine. And healthier walls of this large intestine will block the absorption of unwanted materials into your body. And then insoluble fibers like cereal brands, fruits, and vegetables, those will help increase your stool weight, which will ease your passage and reduce the time it needs to move through. So that will prevent constipation and the risk of swelling of rectal veins. And we talked about that in the previous chapter. Those are hemorrhoids. And it will also prevent against diverticula and by stimulating those GI muscles and keeping their strength and resist the bulging of the intestine. It also can protect against colon cancer. Studies show that people who eat more dietary fiber, this would be 35 grams per day or more, have a reduced risk of colon cancer by 40%. And this is specifically those plant foods, the vegetables, fruits, and whole grains that reduce the colon and rectal cancers. They dilute, bind, and rapidly move those potentially cancer-causing agents through the colon faster. And then soluble fibers in particular, those help stimulate the bacterial fermentation of resistant starch and fiber in the colon. And that will produce those short-chain fatty acids that help lower the pH. And the smaller fat molecules then can activate cancer-killing enzymes and inhibit the inflammation of the colon. So just to go over the benefits of following this high carbohydrate, whole sourced diet, the lowering of the blood pressure and reduced inflammation and improved blood lipids, all from following this diet, will lead to a decrease in the risk of heart disease, an improvement in your health with that. Slow glucose absorption, that will help with diabetes. The increased stool weight and prevention of constipation and reduced transit time, that's going to help with your gut health. And then lastly, those diluting of binding and removing harmful agents and producing those short-chain fatty acids, that is going to lead to helping you prevent colon cancer. And so this is a diagram of what we went over. It's really helpful because it breaks down the specific sources of fiber and how those specifically help with your lowering risks of diseases and bettering your overall health. For the DRI, they make recommendations for carbohydrates. 130 grams is recommended by the RDA. And fiber is also recommended for females. It's 25 grams, for males 38 grams, but on average it's only 16 grams. So that's why it's constantly advertised more fiber, because it has such beneficial effects on your health. However, there is a point to where more of a good thing is a bad thing, and so there isn't an established UL of fiber, but symptoms of consuming too much fiber can lead to malnourishment in specific people that have a smaller capacity. So with more fiber making them feel full, they're not going to eat as much, and that's going to lead to malnourishment from not getting enough nutrients by not eating enough food. And also switching from low fiber to high fiber too suddenly, that can temporarily bring a lot of abdominal discomfort, gas, and diarrhea. So you should increase your fiber at a gradual speed over several weeks to give your GI tract more time to adapt. Drinking plenty of liquids to soften that fiber as it moves through the GI tract is important, as well as selecting fiber-rich foods from a variety of sources. Also, limit the absorption of nutrients, especially with fiber can link to the minerals passing through your intestine, And so that can limit your absorption of minerals, or it can make your bowels move too quickly through the intestine and limit your absorption of nutrients overall. So that's another reason that you need to be careful not to consume too much fiber. And so this is a nice chart that shows you good examples of wholesome food to eat that's high in fiber. And you want to do these things because of the great health benefits, and following that basis of whole grains, vegetables, fruit, and legumes is a great basis to go off of. And so being able to do this, you want to look for 1 ounce is often 15 grams of carbohydrate for the grains, and for vegetables, half a cup is about equal to that, 15 grams of carbohydrates. But remember that corn, peas, and potatoes have a higher starch content, and that fruits, they are normally portioned with cups. So 1 serve or half a cup is about 15 grams of carbohydrates. And also looking for those milk products and protein foods to give you that full overall source of a completely whole diet is going to be the most optimal for your health. It's also very important to read your food labels, because depending on that ingredient list, it's going to be listed in the predominance of the nutrients and the foods that make up the bread. So they make about 1 teaspoon worth of salt in most breads. And so if you have an ingredient listed after salt, and it's like a nutritious ingredient that, oh, I should buy this bread because it has this ingredient in it, it's healthy. If it's after salt, it's most likely a very insignificant ingredient and isn't going to do much for improving your health because it is so small. So make sure that those ingredients that are good for you are listed first in the bread, and that you have wholesome ingredients. High fiber breads may contain purified cellulose or more nutritious whole grains, so look for that. If you're looking for a low carbohydrate bread, that's either going to be made with regular white bread or thinly sliced to reduce the serving, or it could contain soy flour or flaxseed, which has a reduced starch content. Although breads may appear similar, their ingredients vary widely, and you want to look for the whole grain flours that aren't refined, aren't processed, because the more natural and whole the food is, the better it's going to be for your body. And so lastly, we're going to look at the highlights of just carbohydrates in your diet, how that affects with weight loss, weight gain, and your caloric intake, and some of the controversies with that. So people have been linking obesity to the intake of carbohydrates, and it's just been seen as a general trend over the years that people are consuming more carbohydrates and obesity is going up. And that is because they're consuming more carbohydrates, and that's going to increase your daily energy intake, which won't get balanced out if it's too high, that you're consuming more calories than you're burning. Then that is going to lead to weight gain. And most activity levels have been declining, so that's going to counteract and make you gain weight even more. And then with people wanting to go through weight loss, they see that with a decrease in calorie intake, you'll see more progress in losing weight. So there's been a positive correlation between increasing your carbohydrate intake and increasing your energy intake then, which then will lead to weight gain, or weight loss, decreasing your calorie intake, and then that would be a decrease in your carbohydrate and a decrease in your weight. So that is a positive correlation that research has been showing. With time, this is just a better diagram that shows the breakdown of those macronutrients and how they've changed over time. But as you can see, carbohydrates, those in daily intake levels are going up over the years. But due to this, the problem isn't an increase in healthy, wholesome carbohydrates. It's the increase in sugary carbohydrates and those processed foods. And so it's important to note that the increased consumption of added sugars is causing this problem with excess energy intake and increased risks of obesity. And so a big thing is with liquid calories, you're going to be intaking a lot of calories without feeling the effects, feeling full from it, or seeing just how much is in there. A cup, it can be very deceiving versus if you have a big sandwich in your hand, because then you see those calories in front of you, but you don't really see it in the liquid. And also by labeling a carb as bad. When people are labeling, oh, that food is bad for you, that can also have a psychological effect where the restriction almost heightens your desire even more for craving that food. And once that craving is hard to resist, that may become an addiction. And so sugar specifically isn't addictive in the same way as drugs, but they share some of the same biological and psychological systems with rewards and self-control that can lead people to overeat a lot and consume too many sugars for their benefit. When the body consumes a high intake of added sugar, the liver handles this excess by making fat. So either they're stored in the liver or they're transported out into the blood. And when you are consuming such high amounts of added sugar, that's going to rapidly raise your blood lipid levels and increase your fat storages. So that will lead to obesity increasing and those risk factors of developing chronic disease. And so just remember with the fructose, that is going to be converted by the liver, and then that's how it gets into the blood system. And then here under appetite, we'll go over that. Remember, we talked about beverages provide calories without satisfying hunger, and thus the form of food versus, liquid affects appetite. And so with insulin, there are many roles that it plays in the body. It's a hormone, and it regulates your blood glucose levels. And so insulin resistance is going to most often happen due to obesity. And there is a correlation between weight loss and then bettering your insulin sensitivity. So reversing those negative effects of insulin resistance through weight loss. With the glycemic index and body weight, there's great controversy. As I explained before, there's so many factors that can determine your glycemic response that it's hard to solidly depend facts with if the glycemic response is high, then there's going to be weight gain. There just is too many factors. There's how the food is specifically ripened, processed, or cooked. That can help determine the glycemic response. Or the time of day you're eating the food, or the specific food that is eaten with, or whether or not there's a presence of a certain disease like diabetes. Those can all affect your glycemic response and make it different for each person. Studies find that diets with a high glycemic index are positively associated with body weight, but there isn't anything that's proven that low glycemic index is associated with weight loss. There are advantages to the low glycemic meals. They seem to curb the appetite and limit energy intake of the next meal. And it's likely to be rich in nutrients and fiber versus those high glycemic diets. but there aren't any, completely evidence-based conclusions that have shown the glycemic index and weight loss. And so also a person has various individual responses to food because everyone has a personal metabolism that can vary and an insulin sensitivity variation. Low insulin responses to certain dietary carbohydrates and also how the energy is stored after a meal depends on how the body responds to insulin. Some people, their excess glucose is half of it is stored in the muscles, and that makes twice as much fat in the liver. And so research suggests to restrict your carbohydrate intake to improve the glucose control, insulin response, and blood lipids, especially for those people that might be more insulin resistant just because of that's how their metabolism is. So that can have an important role in the way people should intake carbohydrates in their diet.